Hello, as people fill in, we're just going to wait one moment to get started with introductions. Thanks for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. Great. All right. Well, it's 11:01, and I know that people often trickle in after that, but they can catch up with us. I will start by introducing myself. I'm Lewis Wirtz. I'm the Director of Communications at the Western Landowners Alliance. I live in Denver, just outside Denver, Colorado. Um, and I'm very excited to help present this webinar and tee up our panelists today. Joining me on the screen right now is Danny Howlett, WLA's Membership and Outreach Coordinator. And she's joining me as backup tech support. So if you have questions, you want to send her in the chat, things are going wrong, you can't hear someone, something like that, please go ahead and feel free to use the chat to do that. And also because it's a reminder that WLA is a membership organization. The Western Landowners Alliance is founded and led by landowners, and we welcome anyone who is supportive of working lands and whole and healthy landscapes in the West to join. And membership is free. It comes with lots of cool benefits, including our magazine, which the second issue of this year is about to drop. Our seventh volume overall will be in mailboxes this week on land. So if you haven't signed up to be a member of the Western Landowners Alliance, I encourage you to go to our website and do that after the event. So that's the plug there. And then the other two people on the screen are the people you came here to hear. It's Hallie Mahold, our Chief Programs Officer at Western Landowners Alliance, who's down in Central Colorado, and Drew Bennett, Professor of Practice in Private Land Stewardship at the University of Wyoming. They can say a little bit more about their role in the study and their roles in their respective institutions as they get started. And so I'm going to turn it over to Hallie and go off screen and let her introduce the subject and more about why we're all here.
Thanks, Great. Hallie. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good to be here. So as Lewis said, Western Landowners Alliance, we're a landowner-led West-wide organization. We advance policies and practices to sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. In short, we're a network of landowners, managers, partners dedicated to keeping the working lands of the West whole and healthy for the benefit of both people and also wildlife. And as many of you on this webinar are intimately aware, the West is facing increasingly frequent and critical water shortages. Declining flows in the Colorado River Basin over the last century have increased pressure on water users throughout the basin, creating significant challenges for meeting multiple competing demands. So we have prolonged drought, increased demand, and climate change have really led to diminishing water levels in key reservoirs like Lake Mead and Lake Powell, threatening the water supply for millions. And there's really no longer enough water for all of those who depend on it. Now, these shortages pose an immediate and major risk to landowners, particularly agricultural producers, landowners in the Colorado River Basin. And at the same time, landowners control much of the West water and the management of its watersheds. And they're really key to being a part of finding and implementing solutions in this space. And so we really feel like it's critical to understand landowner perspectives and to solicit landowner input if we're going to develop successful strategies to address Western water shortages. So Western Landowners Alliance partnered with Ruckelshaus Institute, which is a division of the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming, which one of the co-authors on the study, Drew Bennett, is from the University of Wyoming and is going to talk more about the study today with us. But we partnered with them to survey more than 6,000 agricultural water users in the Colorado River Basin on what they thought about the current situation, their use of and interest in conservation practices, and really their preferences around strategies to address these water shortages going forward. And now I'm going to pass it over to Drew, who's going to talk more about the key findings, how we put the study together, and what it looks like moving forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Hallie. Really a pleasure to be here with everybody. Thank you so much for joining. As Hallie mentioned, I'm a faculty member in the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources, an affiliate with the Ruckelshaus Institute. And our mission is to advance the understanding and resolution of complex environmental and natural resource challenges in the Mountain West. And we support stakeholder-driven solutions to environmental challenges by conducting and communicating relevant research and promoting collaborative decision-making. So it was really and often we do this through partnerships with organizations and agencies that are on the ground doing this important work. And so it was really a logical connection to work with Western Landowners Alliance and a great partnership to be working with them. So thanks to Hallie and Lewis and everybody else with the WLA team for the opportunity. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here real quick. And go ahead and jump in here. And so this is the report that we released yesterday, and really encourage everybody to check it out, and excited for feedback and further communication. But before I jump in to the findings, I just really want to take a moment to acknowledge people that made this work possible. First and foremost, the participants that participated in the study. We had over 1,020 participants participate in the survey, and dozens of other folks that participated in a focus group and interviews, in-depth interviews. And so any participants are on the webinar today, thank you for your time, because it really is critical and really does take a lot of time to provide this information. A long list of collaborators. This is really a team effort between folks here at the University of Wyoming, Western Landowners Alliance, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, University of Nevada-Reno, and the Wyoming Survey and Analysis Center, in particular, Mike Dorsum. Give a shout out to him who implemented, they did the messy details of sending out the surveys and collating all the data for us. So, and just want to acknowledge the primary funder for this is the Walton Family Foundation, and really appreciate all their work working to find solutions in the Colorado River Basin. And lastly, Regrid provided data for developing the mailing list to identify irrigators in the basin. And so their Data with Purpose program was really critical to our efforts. So thank you to all these folks to make this work possible. So I'm just going to give an overview of some of the key findings here, and then we'll dive into some of the specifics behind these key findings. I think probably not surprising to most people on this call is that there's a high level of concern among agricultural water users or irrigators in the basin about potential impacts to water use. You know, this is a top of mind issue for many folks, and some have already been significantly impacted, and others are really anticipating future impacts. I think, one of the things I think is a positive in some respects is that 70% are already responding to water shortages, either or adopting adaptation strategies. So they recognize the need to adapt, and they're not sitting idly by. I think that creates opportunity for working proactively with land managers out there. On the other hand, we did find that there was low awareness and modest interest in participating in formal programs that were out there, especially some of the federal programs that create some barriers to finding solutions, but also some opportunities that I'll mention going forward. Water trading, kind of water banking approaches, or what we use the term water transfers. There was a good deal of concern about those, which we'll discuss in a little bit, with the one exception of temporary transfers from agriculture to other agricultural users. We did see more interest and support for those types of solutions, but water transfers in general, I think, face a lot of resistance from irrigators in the basin, and for some good reasons as well. And there was major concerns about abandonment or forfeiture, essentially losing their water right by participating in different types of programs or reducing their consumption. Could that lead to them losing that right going forward? And that's going to be a major issue that I think needs to be addressed to get additional buy-in from the agricultural community. And then I think a overwhelming result that we had was this very strong support for local approaches and irrigators really wanting to see locally driven approaches that they felt buy-in and trust in moving forward. So we'll dive into some of the specifics that back up these key findings from the study. I do also want to acknowledge a handful of study limitations before I get too much further along. One of the challenges we had, we used a scientifically sound survey methodology where we mailed out surveys to landowners through multiple contact methods following industry best practices. But there was challenges in specifically identifying and contacting irrigators throughout the basin. We relied primarily on county level parcel data to identify mailing addresses for irrigators. The counties update those, there's a lot of diversity in how often counties update those data sources. So that creates some, so there were some challenges with some of the data, but largely it was pretty good, but there were some gaps in there. And also we were identifying property owners. In many cases, there are lessees that are managing some of these properties that are making decisions about water management. And so there's some limitations there if the owners of the property were not passing along the survey to those that are actually making the water management decisions. There's also the potential for response bias if people feel really passionate about sharing their insights on a topic. They tend to be more commonly responding to surveys. So that's also a common limitation with surveys. And then there's a great deal of diversity across the basin in agriculture and what farming and ranching looks like. And so tailoring our questions to meet the diversity of those different contexts was a challenge. And so it may not be fully representative of the way that agriculture looks in every part of the basin. So I want to acknowledge some of those study limitations. But with that being said, we feel very good about the study design and having a very robust study, again, following some of these best practices and scientific methodologies. And with that, we received 1,020 total responses, and this is the breakdown of those responses from the 6 states that we surveyed in. Nevada is also part of the basin, but we did not include Nevada in the study because they have a very modest amount of irrigated agriculture in the Colorado River Basin portion of Nevada. So overall, we received a 20% response rate. This was much higher in the upper basin states. So upper basin states being Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, and a significantly lower response rate in the lower basin, Arizona and California. And we have some thoughts as to why that is. But again, that might be another limitation of the study is the differences in response rates that we're receiving between the two upper and lower basin areas. And I will break down the results between the upper basin and lower basin because there's differences in how the basin is administered between the upper and lower basin. And so it is a logical way of breaking down some of these results. So just want to flag that for people as I go forward. Just again, talking about some of these differences between the upper and lower basin, just flagging a couple of key things here between the upper and lower basin. Although we received a much higher response rate and more participants in the upper basin, we have a large amount of acreage that is irrigated in the lower basin and a much higher average amount of irrigated acreage in the lower basin relative to the upper basin. And so even though we had a modest number of participants, the amount of acreage that was represented in our survey participants was quite high. And some other differences here, and we think there's a larger number of folks that are leasing out land to manage for farming in the lower basin relative to the upper basin. We see these in some of the response characteristics that we have here. About half is owner-operated property, whereas 81 in the lower basin, whereas 81% in the upper basin is owner-operated, and nearly 90% are residing on their property in the upper basin, whereas it's slightly lower than half in the lower basin. So some differences in what farming and ranching looks like between the upper and lower basin that I think is important to point out going forward. So with that kind of background and who responded, and we did also ask a number of other demographic questions as well about income levels and ethnicity and other demographic characteristics like that. So some of our key findings or information that we collected, we asked about a number of concerns that agricultural water users have in the basin, and these were the top 3 that came about. There's concerns about changes in water policy and changes in water management policy, the potential for new constraints on their own water use, as well as constraints of their neighbors or others in the agricultural industry going forward. And so you can see the level of very concerned and somewhat concerned here. And again, this is going to be the how I'll organize these figures going forward. The darker kind of blue and green bars will be data for the upper basin, and the yellow and orange bars here will be for the lower basin. So again, not a surprise for us conducting this study that there is a great deal of concern out there, that this is a top of mind issue for many in the basin. One of the other things we asked about was perceptions of water management, and we asked a series of questions around this. Here are information about 4 at the agree and strongly agree responses here. One thing I wanted to flag here that was a little bit of a surprise for us was this response to, there is a high level of trust between water users and water management agencies in my state. Not many agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. So again, this sort of lends us to sort of think about this trust gap that is out there, and needing to build additional trust between water management agencies and irrigators will be absolutely critical for finding solutions going forward. That being said, a lot of folks really emphasized the importance of local management in how water was being managed at the state, and this came through in interviews and focus group data as well, really emphasizing the preference for local management versus top-down types of solutions. One of the things that I think was encouraging is that a number of water managers are currently adopting conservation practices or adaptation practices. Roughly 70% in both the upper and lower basin are already doing something to adapt to shortages or anticipating shortages going forward. We asked about 11 specific practices or adaptation strategies, and 70% had done 1 or more of those. So I think it really shows that there is people are responding and are open to responding and experimenting with different strategies going forward, which I think provides the foundation for finding win-win solutions going forward. That being said, some of the questions we asked about were participation or interest in specific conservation programs, either at the federal or regional level. On the left-hand side are 4 specific conservation programs that we asked about, and 2 more general water leasing or water banking types of programs. The unshaded bars here are represent a response that says, I am not aware of this program and have not participated. And so we can see, I think the general takeaway from this relatively busy slide or figure is that there's not a lot of awareness for a number of these programs that are out there. I'll highlight 2 programs in particular. I think one of the exceptions is NRCS's EQIP program, which is one of the most commonly used programs, farm bill programs that is out there. Much higher levels of awareness of that program, which wasn't surprising to us. And then what was a little bit surprising was this awareness about the system conservation pilot program. That's been one of the efforts to try to reduce water consumption, specifically in the Colorado River Basin. 88% in the upper basin and 80% in the lower basin were unaware of these efforts. So I think that speaks to opportunities here for increasing awareness about these different programs that are out there. And I think if we look at just the system conservation pilot program, about 50% of the individuals that were aware of these programs were interested in participating or have participated in the past. So I think if that increase in awareness, if we have an increase in awareness, that might translate into greater participation and an opportunity for solutions in the basin. And this is, again, the underscoring another question we asked was their preference for administering water conservation programs. And overwhelmingly, a local agency was the preferred entity to manage these types of programs, followed by a modest number preferring a state agency, and a very low percentage for 2% for a federal agency. I think it's notable that water rights are administered by states in the basin. And so states have to play a role in this, but figuring out ways that local agencies can also be involved will be really, really critical. So, these types of solutions could come from a combination of these, but really positioning local agencies will be critical for closing that trust gap and helping to build support in the basin. Some of the information about, we asked about temporary water transfers and permanent water transfers. And these transfers are broken down. So the left-hand side is temporary, right-hand side permanent. We asked about whether they were from water rights transfers from agricultural water rights to non-agricultural users, and from agricultural to other agricultural users in both of these questions. In general, there was a high level of opposition, which is what I'm showing here, to both temporary and permanent water transfers. I think with the exception being here, the temporary transfers from ag to ag, and slightly less, a little bit more opposition than to permanent transfers from agriculture to other agricultural users, but a good deal of opposition to non-agricultural water users. So I think that's a important finding of the potential for water banking or water leasing solutions of overcoming some of that opposition. And we asked about some of the barriers to water transfers. We asked about several different barriers. These were the top two that emerged, one being insufficient financial compensation, and the other being about losing their water rights even in a temporary transfer arrangement. And this came up in some of our interview data and focus group data as well, that there was concern that participating in conservation programs, if it resulted in reduced consumptive use of water, could that lead to them then using the ability to use that water right going forward? Even if that's not the case, and there are protections in place for participating in some of these programs, that is a concern that I think really needs to be addressed. And again, building local buy-in and support at that local level will go a long way to helping to address some of these concerns. We asked about several different water conservation practices that are part of a formal demand management or system conservation program. There was modest interest in most of these. The top one that emerged was investments that reduce water use by enhancing delivery systems, or another way of putting that is investments in infrastructure improvements to reduce water use, and that had the highest overall likelihood of participation. And I think that's not surprising. I think there's a great deal of interest in infrastructure improvements. However, there is some concern about questions about whether some of those infrastructure improvements lend themselves to actual overall reduced consumptive use. And I think that's a concern that needs to be addressed if that's a key strategy going forward. If it's pretty technical is how that the accounting goes for some of the addressing some of those questions about consumptive use, but something that really needs to be addressed if that's going to be one of the solutions that could be a win-win. I think surprising to us, the research team was some of the next highest levels of likelihood of adoption were what would require everyone on a tributary or irrigation ditch or district to agree to a certain amount of reduction in water use or to adopt the same management practices. So really focusing on the sort of collective nature, recognizing that agricultural water users are often working with irrigation districts or ditch systems to manage their water, getting that local community support, that collective support at that level, I think could be really a key strategy rather than just looking at adoption from one farm or ranch to the next. I think this could be a strategy that could be used going forward. So I'll put a plug in really quickly before I wrap up here in just a second. This is a URL that will take you to a dashboard, and we encourage folks to explore the data yourselves. We have a number of other questions included in this dashboard that we didn't have space in the report to include, and I certainly don't have time to present today. It also will allow you to filter the data if you're interested in responses by individual states that were surveyed, or for different types of operation, like primarily livestock operations or row crop operations. You can filter the data in different ways. So I encourage you to check out that website to explore further. And just to conclude, and then I'll kick it back to Hallie to wrap us up and then open it up for questions. But I think what some of the key insights that we can take from this report to move the basin forward. First, I think there's a recognition of a need to adapt, and we saw that both from the agricultural water users. They recognize that the status quo is not sufficient going forward. Encouragingly, I think we also see that among the states and from the Upper Colorado River Commission as well, of adapting their programs and tailoring them to improve them going forward. And I think that will be really essential to finding these programs that work and strategies that work. I think it's also important to point out this is not a political election. These responses, you don't need a majority or plurality of responses to or support to be a viable solution. So, even a strategy that has 15 or 20% interest in adoption could be meaningful into closing the gap and addressing the chronic water shortages that are out there. And especially thinking about these different practices and programs as part of a portfolio that's going to be implemented and developed. Even modest participation in some of these efforts can play a key role going forward. So just the caveat to some of the low levels of likelihood of adoption for some of these practices may not be that concerning in certain respects. I also think that it's going to be essential to close this trust gap. And there's already great people out there doing good work. We heard, I'll put a plug in for graduate student Max Lewis here at the University of Wyoming. He's been doing interviews with irrigators in the upper basin and really finding that there's folks from the Nature Conservancy, from Trout Unlimited, a number of other organizations. Put a shout out to the Wyoming State Engineer's Office for really doing good work to try to address this trust gap and building buy-in and support. I think the capacity levels are a concern, and additional capacity out there to increase the trust. Roles that groups like Western Landowners Alliance can play, I think can also be a critical role in addressing that trust gap and getting people comfortable with some of these solutions going forward. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity, and we see some good some efforts that I think could provide some good blueprints that are already out there. And then lastly, just keep beating this drum, building local support, finding strategies that are locally tailored, locally implemented will be critical to go forward. So I think the more that those programs can find that local capacity and local support, the better. So with that, really appreciate everybody's time and sticking with us this morning. And I will kick it back over to Hallie.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Drew. Thanks for sharing those insights and all the key findings from the report. And I just want to kind of finish by, I guess, continuing to beat the drum of kind of the need for these solutions to be successful. They have to both work on the ground in the local context, as Drew's talking about, and also be really directly informed by those on the ground that are managing the resources every day. This is why WLA works to bring landowners together to inform and support solutions, and really understanding the perspectives and preferences of agricultural water users, as documented in this report, can really help guide the development of solutions that can work in the basin. And I would say, the existing policy processes and programs, whether those are focused on urgent conservation needs or we're looking longer term for basin-wide water management strategies, they really offer a chance to actively involve the agricultural water user community. And this involvement can help support the adaptation of operations to lessen the effects of water scarcity and to sustain agricultural livelihoods, and which in turn supports not only food production, but open space, wildlife habitat, healthy watersheds, and so much more in the basin. So just the input and participation of these folks, ensuring that they have a seat at the table where decisions are made as new programs are developed, as we continue to tweak existing programs, build those relationships, try to work on closing that trust gap. That engagement, that participation really holds the potential to make, I think, a significant and positive difference in outcomes as we're looking to the future of the Colorado River Basin and its management. So that's what I'd wrap up with. And I think now, Lewis, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're moving to kind of Q&A, which can happen in the chat, or as Lewis said, he could pull folks up on stage to ask questions as well.
Great. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. I think we have time to get to those. And then if you have others, you can add them in or message me in the chat and let me know that you'd like to ask a question on stage. The first question is from Marianne Goodland, who's with Colorado Politics. She wonders how the proportion of responses matched with the proportion of irrigators in each of the states in the basin, and then whether especially interested in that large Colorado number relative to other numbers and what that implications are there.
Yeah, great question, Marianne. And to your first question on there about the margin of error, our margin of error is right about 4%, a little bit lower than that. I want to say it was 3.9%. At least, by the way, there's different ways of calculating that, which I won't bore everybody with, but and that's pretty on par with these types of surveys, usually aiming for about a 5% margin of error. So we were happy with that. And then the other question about the proportion. So we did when we developed the sample, we identified as best as we could the total number of irrigators in each of the 6 states. And then we did a weighted sample that essentially weighted it so that the proportion of surveys that we sent out was proportional to the total number of irrigators. So Colorado has the largest number of irrigators in the basin. So that is partly why it's pretty heavily skewed that way. It's an excellent question about how the influence of Colorado overall, at least in the upper basin, because it is about half of the total upper basin responses. So it does play an important part in shaping that. We actually didn't see, at least in some preliminary analysis, that much difference between some of the upper basin states, and so we saw a lot of similarities. So I think it probably played a role, but I don't think it was that critical. I think we see a lot of similarities between the upper basin states, and more differences between upper basin and lower basin, but even a lot of similarities there as well.
And Drew, to that point, I think there's a follow-up question from Alex Hager at KUNC that asks about, do you feel that the survey results would look significantly different if more Arizona and California growers were polled? I guess another way to put that is, is there a way to weight responses based on acreage, or because we have fewer irrigators overall, but representing larger acreage in those states? Yeah.
It's a great question. And I'm not sure, I think my gut says it probably wouldn't change too much. But I think it certainly could, because there is whenever you have a lower number of responses, then every individual response has influences the data a little bit more. But I think with that being said, I think we saw, I think one of the challenges we had in the lower basin, Arizona and California, was trying to wrap our brains around, who actually is making decisions there. So we had some operators that are operating at 14,000 or 16,000 acres, so really large farming operations. That looks very different than, say, a rancher that's irrigating 150 acres of hay or alfalfa in the upper basin, and so those are significant differences. And so I think there could be some, if we had some of the smaller farmers in the lower basin, if we had a higher number of those might change some of those results a little bit, but I don't know. It's hard to sort of say, I guess. It's a tough answer, and I wish we had more data there to address that.
I would just jump in and just, Drew, to say, anecdotally, I felt like in some of our individual interviews that there was a feeling, at least from some of the folks in the lower basin, there seemed to be less of a feeling of kind of being they felt more like they were at the mercy of the decisions that were being made, and felt like they were less able to maybe proactively take part in solutions. I think they felt a lot more like their water was going to be shut off, and maybe like they had less control over that management, and that a lot of the programs are really aimed more at that upper basin. And so I felt like it's not exactly to the question, but there seemed to be maybe a little bit less kind of hope in being able to be part of the solution coming out of the lower basin, although I will say that it did seem, I guess I'll say a surprise. I thought there might be more differences in our survey results, but a lot of the questions actually lined up to be quite similar between the two basins.
Yeah, great. Thank you both for tackling that. It's obviously complicated. Monique asks, yeah, if you could provide an example of or some examples of investments that reduce water use by enhancing delivery systems, which was that most common popular solution set.
Yeah, exactly. And a sort of technical or wonky way of saying, infrastructure improvements is probably a clear way of stating that. But, an example would be of switching, say, an irrigation system to, say, like a sprinkler system, center pivot, or a drip irrigation system, versus, say, a flood irrigation or another type of irrigation practice. Another example might be lining a ditch. A lot of ditches are soil or dirt ditches, lining them with concrete or something that would reduce the amount of water that's going into the groundwater there. And as I mentioned, I think that it's really contextual as to whether those sorts of investments reduce water consumption. For instance, if lining irrigation canals or ditches, if you're reducing some of that water that's going into the groundwater, in some systems that groundwater will actually return back to the river, and so it's not actually being lost to the system. It stays in the system, and so you don't actually end up with that much of an improvement or reduction in consumptive use. So I think it really is, some of those investments really depend. It's highly contextual to the individual property as well as the geology in the area, as to of how viable those solutions are in actually reducing water consumption.
Great, thanks, Drew. Callie asks if you can speak, maybe this is a good question for Hallie, any examples of local strategies which came through in focus groups or interviews, and that may not have been fully captured by survey questions that people were interested in or that were operational. And that sort of points to Alex Hager's follow-up question, which maybe you could elaborate on as I get into this, which is, do we have any examples or recommendations as to how federal and state agencies can close that trust gap? And what, especially given the difference between conservation programs and the level of awareness of those big ones that are the sort of flagship programs amongst irrigators.
Yeah, maybe I'll take on Alex's to start, and then I might actually throw it to you, Drew, on kind of some of the local strategies showing up in those specifically in interviews. But I guess to your question, Alex, about kind of this trust gap, I mean, one big thing I'll say is, the rollout of some of these programs, right? There is a need for more awareness. I think there is, I think one way to close that trust gap is just for the agencies that have field staff and folks locally, like, improved communication from the top of those agencies as these programs are rolled out. Oftentimes there are tight timelines. There can be confusing information. There can be communication gaps within agencies so that local and field staff don't have the information they need to be able to deliver those programs. And then if landowners are signing up or they're getting mixed information, I think that can increase kind of that lack of trust or desire to engage in the programs. So I think there's a need to get more information out around the programs, and also just more collaboration between the federal or state agencies and local groups that are working with ag water users. So whether those are nonprofit organizations that have staff on the ground, or conservation districts, local stock growers groups. I mean, there's a lot of folks in that space. And so taking, I think, the time to build those relationships. And I think with some of the urgency in these programs, it's often like there's funding coming in. We're going to set the deadline 2 weeks from now to try to put together this huge project where there isn't yet maybe the project planning and funding for those projects to be shovel ready. And then sometimes those deadlines get extended, communication is faulty. So I just think maybe while it's hard because these are pressing issues, more time and attention to relationships and also to that need for collaboration for these programs to be successful. because it's really important, especially as there's more federal funding available, that if there's really a desire for that to support solutions on the ground, I think there's just a need to take the time to ensure both communication and also being able to figure out what are those existing relationships, and how do we also ensure as we build these programs that we have, landowners and these ag water users at the table developing those programs and bought into what those programs could look like, and even being flexible to those local contexts. Yeah, that'd be my big kind of answer there, is sometimes it feels like there's a lot of folks that are working in silos, and then when it goes to roll out on the ground, questions can't be answered, or the programs are laborious, or the timelines are too tight. And so really looking at where there are those barriers and attempting to address them. And then the last one I'll say is, again, just coming back to the study, the need to actually be able to answer questions around what is the potential of what could happen to water rights if people participate in those programs, and ensuring that across the level of those staff, those programs at the state level, we can provide more understanding for landowners on, will their water rights be secured? How does that look if they participate? Since that was the biggest barrier to participation that we found.
Thanks, Hallie. And I agree with lots of that. And I think the other point I'll make is, I think as more farmers and ranchers participate in these programs, they're going to be the best spokespeople for those programs and talking about their own experiences. And I think there have been, system conservation pilot program, a lot of folks that have had positive experiences. And I think, if there's sort of skepticism or mistrust among others in their community, they're going to be the ones that are going to be the best to speak to how that program worked for them. So I think that'll be important. I think, as there's more participants going forward, I think you see sort of build up and interest also build. I think to Callie's question about, other local opportunities, I think one of the things that came up in some of the interviews, and a good example, interviews and some of the focus group we did, was the example of the Colorado Water Conservation Board's granting program. Felt like it was very much tailored to local working groups that were able to develop kind of how they wanted that program to be administered and delivered. And I think that's a one example of ways that there can be meaningful local involvement, is sort of creating these larger structures, in this case at the state level, but having them be really locally driven, and also cutting through the bureaucracy of actually delivering the funds to do the work, I think will be really important. Contrasting that with, say, some NRCS programs or some of the typical Farm Bill programs we might think of. We had one interview participant, and I think this was sort of shared, maybe not as pointedly in this way, but somebody said that they had been working for months and months, if not years, trying to do an EQIP program through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they just said that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze of what it was. It was just too much labor, too much paperwork, and putting yourself in the shoes of some of these farmers and ranchers. They're thinking about commodity prices. They're thinking about, when they need to get out and irrigate. They're thinking about, payroll and all those sorts of things. Working through the logistics of participating in some of these programs is not the top priority for them, because they're also trying to run an operation. So I think that's important to point out, as well as increasing the ease with which these individuals can participate, I think will be really important.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Hallie. Yeah. Another pretty specific question comes from Wade Warrens, who mentions or calls to our attention that the study reports on, some openness for reverse auctions, and just wondered if we could elaborate on what specifically that is meant there.
Sure. Yep. So reverse auction essentially is, I guess, in the context of a water conservation program, might put out whoever's organizing the program, like the system conservation pilot program, as a hypothetical, could organize it in a way where you say, if what would be if you adopted certain practices that reduce consumptive use of water by a certain amount, how much would you need to be compensated for doing so? And then, so in a reverse auction, instead of trying to get the price as high as you can, you're trying to get the price as low as you can. So, the farmers and ranchers would submit bids of what they would be willing to accept for adopting those practices and reducing their water use. And the way that came out, and this really emerged from the focus group we did, was there's a lot of there's not good data about what the market rate for water should be in a lot of places. And so some of these programs are setting sort of the price they're willing to pay for participation at a certain level that may not reflect what that market rate would be. And so these farmers and ranchers, they're used to participating in commodity markets. They understand how what a market rate should be theoretically, and they felt like this would be a way of sort of revealing that price but if everybody had a chance to sort of submit bids as to what they'd be willing to do, then the program administrators could select the ones that they thought were the best value to them, and then that would be a way of sort of identifying what that value would be to farmers and ranchers. And so that would be a more transparent way of trying to compensate for consumptive use. So that was how where that emerged from, and it's an interesting idea. There's some logistical challenges for doing reverse auctions, but I think it holds a lot of potential as well.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. And just to, go back again, and I know you touched on this in the survey results, but the question around kind of the local strategies and things that came up in conversations, because I think it is helpful, particularly as we might talk about maybe a lack of knowledge in the federal programs and also that trust gap, but some of the local strategies. One thing I think you mentioned in the data, Drew, was more interest in strategies where you had collective action, where you had landowners on an irrigation ditch or on a part of a watershed that would all be implementing practices or water sharing together. And one thing that came up in conversations that I had was actually a number of folks that were already doing some water sharing with neighbors to address whether they were on different ditches and were kind of informally trading some of those rights, I think, and trying to think about how they could work together to keep water in the basin, but to support their neighbors. And so not, it's not really looking at a large scale kind of demand management, but at least in a more local context, that water sharing. I will say that though, as there's closer scrutiny on water rights, more measurement of water use and focus on that, there was also an awareness that some of these handshake water sharing agreements really may not be viable anymore, and kind of looking at what it could look like if to try to make that more formal, or what kind of flexibility could exist to keep some of the sharing that was happening. Sometimes in the case, folks are sharing because they want to make sure, for example, that a part of a river doesn't run dry. And so they're allowing water to come down that river to be used by someone else to keep that, to not have that water run dry, to not have kind of the negative ecological consequences of that, but done in a much more informal way than some of these programs are set up currently.
Yeah, exactly, Hallie. And I think just to build on that, one of the things we also heard in the focus group, when we actually presented some of these data back to the focus group and asked specifically about, why is there interest in these more collective solutions? And it was surprising to me as a researcher. And then for them, it was almost a nonsensical question of they're already having to coordinate with their neighbors on how they're managing the ditch system, totally absent from any sort of conservation program. They're coordinating with them as far as, managing head gates and, making decisions about, cleaning out ditches and all kinds of other coordination that's already happening. And so it almost seemed like it would almost be impossible for them to participate in some of these programs if they didn't have the buy-in and support of some of their neighbors that are on some of these collective water infrastructure systems. So I think that it really points to some differences in how water is managed relative to other natural resources. Sometimes that there really is this collective nature to it inherently already with how we have our infrastructure built.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Hallie. I see we've exhausted the questions in the Q&A, and so I was going to tee up one that I had as a closer. And it gets to something that Drew said in his presentation, which I think is worth calling out again, which is that the when you see this knowledge, this not what we kind of identify as a knowledge gap or an awareness gap, that seems pretty large and daunting. When a lot of people in the, maybe in cities, maybe at least in the media, seem, like, oh, how could you not be aware of something as big and complex as the System Conservation Pilot Program? But then you also pointed out that, of the aware group, we have half those people reported that they were willing or had participated. So I guess, just directly, what are the next steps that we have in mind, or that we would encourage other people to do, just to close that awareness gap? And how are we planning to tackle that? How could folks who are on this call maybe contribute to helping close that knowledge gap in a way that also maybe helps reduce that trust gap?
Maybe I'll start, and then I'll let Hallie have the last word. And again, I think it comes back to relationships, and I think a lot of farmers and ranchers are accustomed to in-person relationships and knowing who they're working with. And so I think the more that there can be capacity that's provided, that is on the ground, that is working, having people going out to these properties and meeting face to face, I think that's going to go a long way to building the trust gap. And as I mentioned, the Nature Conservancy and Trout Unlimited have been doing great work. Western Landowners Alliance, all these groups that are out there building those relationships, I think will be really critical. I think similar for states, having meetings, I think it's fine to have these, large meetings that delegations from different states and the federal government are participating in, and places like Denver and Salt Lake and, in the Basin in various locations. However, I think it's really critical to also meet farmers and ranchers where they're at. And so going to the community centers that are important to them, that maybe not are a regional draw, I think will be really important. And people are eager for that information. And I think that shows, and some of this is happening, I should say. So it's not reinventing the wheel. I think it's just, continuing to do that and increasing the capacity to do that, I think will be really critical. And then again, I think that the best spokespeople for these programs and different solutions will be their peers. And so people from their communities or neighboring communities that have positive experiences, having them be the spokespeople for sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly of their experiences, that's going to go a long way to building trust. And so I really think that the more we can elevate those voices, the better we'll be at finding some of these, closing that gap in lots of ways. So.
Yeah, well, Drew, this is why why we love partnering with Drew. I feel like you really nailed it on the answer that I would have given for Western Landowners Alliance too. I would just say, we really focus a lot at WLA on peer-to-peer knowledge sharing, on the importance of landowner to landowner communication in our communication channels. And as you were saying, getting out on the ground with local partners, with landowners, for really having kind of the boots on the ground to share about these programs and about the resources that are available. And so I know that we are even expanding our capacity in that space to try to get more folks from our organization and more partnerships with local organizations to be able to better deliver kind of information about these programs, and also help folks understand kind of what they're about. We also are working on trying to kind of streamline and simplify actually the delivery of these programs so that they are easier for landowners to engage in. So once they know about something like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, like EQIP, how do we kind of break down some of those barriers on that delivery coming out of the agency so folks can participate? So it's kind of that peer-to-peer knowledge sharing, getting that information out, some kind of boots on the ground for those relationships. And then I guess the last thing I'll just plug is kind of, WLA is also working to kind of get landowners together in groups to really be able to talk through these challenges, through these potential solutions, and try to contribute meaningfully to the development of policies and practices. So in line with the way that it's happening in other, processes in these states, but trying to kind of create more of that collective voice to to continue to be proactive in these solutions.
Great. Thank you both. And thank you so much for the questions from the audience and for your time today, everyone. Again, just a final plug. There'll be a follow-up question as you sign off. Please please join the Western Landowners Alliance, share the survey results, and thank you again for your participation.
Thanks everybody for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.